the foster father and the lawyer daughter. 15 years ago, Daniel Ashford was nothing more than a poor single father who spotted a homeless girl shivering under the awning of a bus station and decided to take her home. He gave her his last name, a bed to sleep in, and a reason to believe the world still held decent people. 15 years later, that same man was dragged into a courtroom, branded a fraud, and told he was about to lose a $900 million empire. But when the courtroom doors finally swung open, the little girl from that rainy night walked in wearing a lawyer's suit. The rain came down hard over the city that night, the kind of cold spring downpour that turned the harbor into a sheet of hammered iron. Daniel had just finished a double shift at the port, and the smell of engine oil and sea salt still clung to his jacket like a second skin. He was 31 then, a widower with grease permanently worked into the creases of his knuckles, and he wanted nothing more than to buy a little food and get home to his son, Eli, who was waiting up past his bedtime. Daniel walked past the old bus depot with his collar turned up against the wind, his mind already halfway to the small apartment where a boy would run to the door the moment he heard the key turn. That was when he saw her. A girl, maybe 9 years old, sat curled beneath the depot's cracked awning with her knees pulled to her chest and a torn backpack clutched to her body like the last thing she owned in the world. Her hair was soaked through. Her shoes had holes at the toes. She watched the passing strangers with the guarded stillness of a child who had learned that hoping for help usually cost more than it gave. No one had come for her. No one seemed to be looking. Daniel slowed his steps, and something in his chest that had gone quiet since his wife's death began, against his will, to stir. He didn't act on impulse. Impulse was a luxury poor men could rarely afford. He knew a grown man approaching a lost child in the dark could frighten her worse than the cold, so he kept his distance, crouched a few paces away, and asked her name in the same low voice he used to comb his own son out of a nightmare. She told him her name was Nora Bellamy, and nothing more. He called the police from the payphone across the street and asked them to send someone from Child Services, because he wanted every part of this done the right way, in the light, with nothing hidden. But he didn't leave. He bought a carton of warm milk from the all-night counter and a cheap coat from the 24-hour shop on the corner, and set them both beside her without a word. She didn't thank him, not at first. She only studied the coat and the milk as though they might be a trick. Then, after a long moment, she asked him a single question that would stay lodged in his heart for the rest of his life. "Are you coming back?" Daniel went still. He knew that question. He had heard it in his own son's voice on the nights he worked late, and he had felt its weight in his own chest as a boy, waiting on a porch for a father who never returned. He looked at this soaked, wary, motherless child and understood she wasn't asking about tonight. She was asking whether anyone in the entire world would choose to keep her. The months that followed were made of paperwork and patience. Daniel submitted to interviews, home visits, and endless forms, and slowly he became her legal guardian. Then, in a small county office under fluorescent lights and a tired clerk's gaze, he became her father. He wasn't rich when he did it. He wasn't powerful, and he had nothing to prove to anyone watching, because no one was watching. He took Nora in for the plainest reason a person can have, simple kindness, offered at a moment when he himself could barely keep his own head above water. On the day the adoption was finalized, he placed a house key into her small palm and folded her fingers over it. Then he told her something she would carry for 15 years, "In this house, nobody gets left out in the rain." That sentence became the promise at the center of everything that came after. Time moved the way it always does, faster than anyone expects. Daniel kept his job at the port by day, repairing tractor units and stubborn diesel engines, and by night, at the kitchen table under a lamp with a bent shade, he taught himself the business of freight. He noticed what the men in suits never bothered to see, that the whole industry bled money from 1,000 small wounds. Trucks ran empty on return trips. Cold storage sat idle waiting on orders that arrived too late. Containers froze at the docks for days because the big companies guarded their data like misers and refused to coordinate. Daniel had spent his whole life inside those wounds, and he began to imagine, piece by piece, how a man might stitch them closed. From a cramped garage with a leaking roof, he founded Ashford Harbor Services with 3 secondhand trucks and a crude dispatch program that Eli and Nora helped him refine once they were old enough to sit at a keyboard. What Daniel had that others lacked couldn't be bought at any price. He understood the workers, the drivers, the mechanics, the longshoremen who moved freight with their own backs, because he had been every one of them. He didn't build his company from a boardroom. He built it out of mud and sweat and the plain honor of keeping a delivery time he'd promised. Word spread among the men who mattered that Ashford was a name you could trust. Nora grew up inside that world, absorbing from her adoptive father a patience and self-respect no school could teach. She was never a fragile creature in the corner. She appeared in the story of those years as a series of small bright moments. A teenage girl standing in the oily light of the garage reading a battered book on contract law, listening while Daniel explained the fine print of a shipping agreement, asking him why poor people always seemed to lose the moment they failed to understand the paperwork. Daniel had no easy answer, but he gave her the truest one he had. In this life, you might not have money, but never once sign a thing you haven't read to the very last word. That single sentence planted a seed that would one day grow into everything. Nora decided she would study law, and when the tuition bills came due, Daniel sold the very first truck he'd ever bought to cover them, even though the company badly needed the cash that season. Eli, older now and thinking of the girl as a true sister, stood with his father and said that if Nora wanted to become a lawyer, the whole family would carry that dream together. Over 15 years, Ashford Harbor Services grew into Ashford Harbor and Rail, a logistics empire worth nearly $900 million, with dry ports, cold chain warehouses, and a private rail line threading across state borders. But the larger the company became, the more strangers Daniel was forced to seat around his boardroom table, and that, though he didn't yet know it, was where the danger began. In the present day, Daniel Ashford was no longer a broke mechanic with grease under his nails. He was the founder of an empire that owned dry ports, refrigerated warehouses, a private railway, and federal shipping contracts moving goods across the whole eastern seaboard. And yet he still wore the same worn canvas jacket he'd worn at the docks, still laced up steel-toed work boots every morning, and still took his lunch on an overturned crate beside the drivers rather than in any glass-walled dining room. To the men who moved the freight, that simplicity made him a king worth following. To the board of directors, it made him a relic. Preston Hale, the chairman of that board, had decided that a man who ate lunch with truckers was no longer fit to steer a corporation approaching $1 billion in value. He was a polished creature of committees and quiet lunches, and he'd come to see Daniel's plain habits as a weakness to exploit rather than a virtue to honor. Hale formed a private alliance with Vivian Cross, the chief executive of Cross Capital, a woman who came from old financial blood and wore her ambition the way other people wore perfume. Together, they devised a plan to force Daniel to surrender his controlling shares at a fraction of their worth, then swallow the whole empire he'd built from 3 rusted trucks. Their scheme was patient and precise. Hale engineered a lawsuit built around an old military freight contract, accusing Daniel of using company assets to fund a private trust for his family, and most pointedly for Nora, the adopted daughter who shared none of his blood. The goal was to convince a court to freeze Daniel's voting rights, pry him loose from the founder's chair, and sell the crippled company straight into the arms of Cross Capital. It was elegant, cruel, and designed to make Daniel's greatest act of decency look like the mechanism of a fraud. What blindsided Daniel was that the documents his enemies produced all bore a signature that looked exactly like his own. The trust account created in Nora's name was twisted into evidence that he'd been quietly bleeding the company dry to enrich a girl he'd picked up off the street. The story leaked, and soon the very people who had once praised his rise began calling him a hypocrite, a sentimental fraud who wrapped his greed in the language of charity. Eli burned to strike back at once, to march into the press and tear the accusations apart. But Daniel held him still with a hand on his shoulder and the calm of a man who had survived worse storms. He believed the truth had its own current, and that if he refused to panic, it would find its way to the surface in time. Still, the thing that wounded him wasn't the threat to his fortune. He had been poor before and knew he could survive being poor again. What cut him to the bone was the way they used Nora's past, holding up the single most human act of his life and calling it a weakness, a sentimental mistake a serious man would never have made. On the final evening before it all came to a head, a courier arrived at Daniel's door with a summons. In 72 hours, a hearing would decide the fate of everything he'd built. When the crisis broke open, everyone who loved Daniel went looking for Nora. She had grown into a young attorney based in Washington, specializing in trust law and corporate fraud, precisely the fields now threatening to consume her father. She was, by any measure, the one person alive most equipped to defend him. But at the exact hour Daniel needed her most, Nora didn't answer her phone. Her office said only that she was away. Her apartment sat dark. The messages went unreturned, and the silence stretched out like a held breath. That silence bred suspicion, and suspicion is a hungry thing. Rivals whispered that even Daniel Ashford's own adopted daughter wouldn't stand up to defend him, and surely that told the world something rotten lived inside the Ashford family. Vivian Cross, in a chilly interview delivered from a marble lobby, remarked that an empire could never be run on pity, and that sentiment had finally caught up with a foolish old man. Daniel didn't blame Nora. In the quiet of his study, he lifted an old photograph from his desk, a faded picture from a rainy night at a bus depot, a small girl wearing the cheap coat he'd bought her, standing beside a young Eli, smiling so faintly you had to know her to see it. He held the photograph a long time. Then he told Carol Whitman, the loyal legal secretary who had stood by him for years, that Nora owed him nothing at all. He hadn't taken her in so that one day she would repay the debt. He'd taken her in because a child was cold, and no arithmetic of gratitude had ever entered into it. That refusal to treat love as a ledger made Daniel larger in that dark hour, not smaller. What no one knew was that Nora hadn't vanished out of fear or betrayal. She was hundreds of miles away, moving through the dim backrooms of an old law office, hunting for the original of a trust document that Carol Whitman had once been entrusted to keep safe. In the course of that search, she discovered something that changed the entire shape of the accusation. The fund standing in her name wasn't money Daniel had siphoned out of the company at all. It was a founder's protective trust, established long before Ashford Harbor and Rail ever went public, built for the express purpose of shielding the company's founding principles from exactly the kind of predators now circling it. Late on the second night, in a records vault thick with dust and the smell of old paper, Nora found what she'd come for. A sealed archival box, its edges frayed with age, and across the front, in Daniel's own careful hand, words she read 3 times before she trusted them, for Nora Bellamy, open when the court finally asks who owns the promise. She sat down on the cold floor with the box in her lap, and for the first time in 15 years, the frightened girl and the sharp young lawyer became the same person again. The hearing convened in the Federal Commercial Court on a gray morning, the air inside the chamber formal, cold, and heavy with pressure. Daniel sat at the defense table beside a temporary attorney who had inherited a case he didn't fully understand, while across the aisle, Preston Hale commanded an expensive phalanx of lawyers led by the notorious Marcus Whitfield, a man who had built his career on strangling opponents with the very contracts they'd signed. Judge Eleanor Voss presided. Stern, famously unbribable, and known for throwing wealthier men than Hale out of her courtroom. Marcus Whitfield opened with the confidence of a man holding a winning hand. He put the wire transfers on the screen, then the trust agreements, then Daniel's signature enlarged until it filled the wall, and finally, deliberately, the adoption papers themselves. He painted a portrait for the court. A sentimental single father who had brought a homeless girl into his home and, blinded by affection, quietly funneled company assets into her keeping. It was a masterful and poisonous performance, because it didn't merely attack Daniel's finances, it attacked his dignity, taking the kindest thing the man had ever done and reforging it into a weapon aimed at his heart. Whitfield asked Daniel directly, in front of the packed gallery, whether he had adopted a girl named Nora Bellamy. Daniel answered that he had. Whitfield asked whether he had established a fund bearing her name. Daniel answered again that he had. A murmur ran through the chamber, and outside the courtroom the story flashed across every wire. The founder had confessed to moving assets to his adopted child. Daniel's borrowed lawyer rose to explain that the trust was entirely lawful, created for legitimate purposes. But without the original terms in hand, his words rang thin, and the judge's expression didn't soften. The momentum in the room shifted hard against the defense. Judge Voss lifted her eyes from her papers and asked whether the defense had any further witnesses or documents to present. Daniel's attorney fell silent. The heavy doors at the back of the courtroom stayed shut. Nora had not come. And then, in the exact moment the judge lifted her pen to sign a preliminary order, those doors swung open. A young woman in a dark tailored suit walked in with an old leather portfolio under her arm. She didn't hurry. She didn't look frightened. She offered no flustered apology for the interruption. She walked straight to the clerk's table with the steady stride of someone who had rehearsed this entrance in her mind 100 times, and said in a clear, even voice, "Nora Bellamy Ashford, counsel of record for the defense. I move to submit emergency evidence." The whole chamber went silent. Daniel turned in his chair and looked at her, and for one suspended moment he didn't see an attorney at all. He saw a soaked 9-year-old under a bus depot awning, asking whether anyone would ever come back for her. But Nora didn't let the emotion of that gaze weaken her. She stood straight, chin level, voice steady and professional, and waited for the court to acknowledge her the way any officer of the law would wait. Whatever storm of feeling moved beneath her calm surface, she had locked it away behind 15 years of the patience her father had taught her. Marcus Whitfield was on his feet at once, objecting that Nora carried an obvious conflict of interest as the adopted daughter of the defendant. Nora answered without a flicker of heat. Since the plaintiffs had made her identity and adoption the very centerpiece of their accusations, she had every right to appear both as a witness to the truth of the trust and as supporting counsel on its terms. The logic was clean, and it turned Whitfield's own strategy against him. Judge Voss, after a long, measured look at both of them, permitted Nora to present a preliminary statement. Nora opened the leather portfolio and drew out the original Ashford Founders Trust, created years before the company ever incorporated. She laid it before the court and walked the judge through its plain language that proved something no one on the plaintiff's side wanted proven: Daniel hadn't moved company assets into the hands of his adopted daughter. He'd done the opposite. He had placed a portion of his founding shares into a protective trust for the express purpose of stopping the board from ever selling the company in violation of the principles it was built on. The fund wasn't a theft. It was a wall. That was the first reversal, and it landed hard. Nora wasn't the secret recipient of stolen money, she was the appointed guardian of the founding shares, the person Daniel had chosen to protect the heart of the company if he was ever driven from it by fraud. The girl the plaintiffs had held up as proof of Daniel's corruption was, by the plain terms of his own document, the one safeguard he'd built against exactly the kind of corruption now surrounding him. Nora turned and looked across the aisle at Preston Hale. "The question was never what my father took out of this company," she said, without raising her voice. "The question is who is trying to sell what was never theirs to sell." She moved to her second piece of evidence. A letter handwritten by Daniel on the day her adoption was finalized. Whitfield scoffed that a sentimental family note carried no weight in a court of law. But Nora was ready. She demonstrated that the letter hadn't been kept in a drawer as a keepsake, it had been formally attached to the trust documents as the founders' declared statement of intent, incorporated by reference into the legal instrument itself, and therefore carried the force of the trust that contained it. She read from it, and the courtroom grew very still. Daniel had written that he'd lost his family once and would not stand by while anyone was left behind simply because they lacked a great name or a fortune. He'd written that he wasn't establishing the trust to make Nora wealthy, but to protect the company from the sort of men who would one day try to turn it into a machine for their own speculation. And he'd written a line that now seemed to reach forward across the years. If the board ever used Nora's past as a weapon against the Ashford family, that act itself would be proof that they had betrayed the founding spirit of the company, and the trust's protections were to activate the moment such a betrayal occurred. The chamber fell into a different kind of silence, the silence of people who have watched a trap spring shut but can't yet tell who stands inside it. The letter connected directly to a specific clause buried in the founders' trust: if the board sought to sell controlling shares to a third party by manufacturing a false accusation against the founder, a reserve voting authority would pass to the guardian of the trust. And the guardian, named in the document years ago, was Nora. Whitfield objected furiously that the clause had long since expired. Nora answered by producing the annual renewal filings, submitted precisely on schedule every year by Carol Whitman. Carol was called to the stand and took her oath with the quiet firmness of a woman who had waited a long time to tell the truth. She confirmed that Daniel had always kept the trust transparent, reporting it fully and filing its renewals without fail. And then she confirmed the thing that turned the whole gallery cold. Preston Hale had deliberately hidden those reports from the rest of the board, burying the very documents that would have proven the trust legitimate, so that when his manufactured lawsuit arrived, no director would remember that Daniel had done everything in the open. Across the aisle, Vivian Cross's composure finally cracked, because she understood before anyone else that if this clause was recognized as valid, her entire acquisition would collapse. Nora presented a chain of internal messages between Preston Hale and Vivian Cross, in which the two conspirators spoke with the careless cruelty of people who believed no one would ever read their words aloud. Hale had agreed to apply legal pressure to drive down the price of Ashford Harbour and Rail before Cross Capital made its formal offer to buy. They'd referred to Daniel as the old mechanic with a family weakness, and to Nora as the emotional card that could be flipped into a financial accusation. Those words struck Daniel like a physical blow, but they also stripped the last mask from the people arrayed against him, and the courtroom saw the coldness beneath the tailored suits. Whitfield scrambled to argue the messages had been altered. Nora was ready for that too, entering the metadata, digital signatures, and certification of an independent forensic examiner who had verified every line. Then she delivered the blow beneath the blow, records of a payment routed from a shell company controlled by Cross Capital into a consulting account belonging to Preston Hale, labeled with almost laughable arrogance as a strategic advisory fee. The date of that payment fell on the very same day Hale had filed his lawsuit against Daniel, timing no judge in the world could believe was coincidence. Judge Voss turned to Hale and demanded, in a voice gone flat and dangerous, that he explain the payment. For the first time in the entire proceeding, Preston Hale faltered. The larger reversal came when Nora produced the sealed minutes of a private meeting in which Hale had promised Cross that if Daniel's voting rights could be frozen, the board would sell 51% of Ashford Harbour and Rail at a price 40% below its true value. That single fact detonated in the chamber, because it revealed the scheme wouldn't merely rob Daniel. It would gut every shareholder, betray every employee, and hand thousands of working families to a buyer who intended to strip the company for parts. Judge Voss's demeanor shifted visibly toward the defense, and she ordered an immediate halt to any transactions involving Cross Capital until the full body of evidence could be examined. Nora faced the gallery. "They called my father a man who exploited family sentiment," she said. "But it is they who plan to sell thousands of working families into silence just to turn a quiet profit." Vivian Cross wasn't a woman who accepted defeat gracefully. She directed her counsel to open a line of questioning aimed squarely at Nora's identity, hoping to shake the young lawyer's credibility. It was calculated cruelty, an attempt to make Nora's own history the thing that discredited her. Whitfield led her back through the wounds of her childhood one by one. The night she'd spent homeless, the fact she'd never known her birth parents, the tuition Daniel had paid to send her through law school. His purpose was transparent, cast her as a woman so buried in gratitude she couldn't possibly be objective. A debtor testifying to protect the man who owned her loyalty. Nora didn't crack. She stood perfectly still and let the silence work for her. She admitted all of it freely and without shame. That Daniel had given her a home, a name, an education, a life, and that she'd never pretend otherwise. Then she turned the confession into her sharpest argument. Precisely because Daniel had given her those things, she understood better than anyone alive the difference between a debt and a promise. A debt is something you repay to be free of it. A promise is something you keep because of who you've chosen to be. She hadn't come to that courtroom to repay a debt with emotion. She'd come because the documents in her hands proved the truth, and the truth needed no gratitude to make it real. Then Nora unveiled the piece of evidence no one had seen coming. Vivian Cross, she revealed, had tried to reach her before the hearing began. Through an intermediary, Cross had offered Nora a partnership position at a prestigious New York firm, along with a substantial sum of money, on one condition, that she simply failed to appear in court. Nora had recorded the entire meeting lawfully, in full accordance with the recording statutes of the state where it took place, because the instinct her father had planted in her told her to protect the truth before she ever tried to use it. The recording was played aloud in the chamber. The intermediary's voice rang out with a clarity that left no room for doubt. "Cross Capital doesn't need you to betray your father. We only need you to stay silent." Those words did more damage than any document, because they exposed the true shape of the plot. The conspirators had never required Nora's treachery, only her absence. Silence itself was the instrument by which they meant to steal the company. Daniel looked at Nora with an expression that held both fierce pride and a father's aching sorrow, understanding at last what those days of her disappearance had truly cost her. The weight she'd carried alone, the enemy she'd walked directly behind in order to gather the final proof. She hadn't abandoned him. She'd gone quiet on purpose, slipping past the defenses of powerful people who would have crushed her the moment they saw her coming, without a word to the man she was protecting. Judge Voss ordered the recording entered into the record and issued a stern warning to the plaintiffs regarding clear signs of witness interference. The gallery felt the case tilt fully onto its new axis. With the evidence accepted and the plot laid bare, Nora turned to the most important provision of the Ashford Founders Trust, the clause Daniel himself had drafted years earlier, praying he would never have cause to use. She read it into the record slowly, so no one could later claim to have misunderstood it. If the founder were ever attacked through a financial accusation tied to his family, and if that accusation were proven to have been manufactured in service of a hostile takeover, the founding voting authority would pass temporarily to the trust's independent protector. And that protector, named in the document years before, was Nora Bellamy Ashford, effective once she came of age and held a license to practice law. The meaning swept through the chamber like a change in air pressure. In the very moment Preston Hale chose to use Nora as the instrument to destroy Daniel, he had unknowingly triggered the legal power that now resided in her. The weapon they'd forged out of her past turned in their hands and became the shield that saved everything. This was the deepest reversal of the entire ordeal. The one that made the gallery gasp aloud, because the person the conspirators had dismissed as Daniel's fatal weakness turned out to be the single figure holding the key to his empire's survival. Nora moved the court to recognize her temporary voting authority, to freeze the cross-capital acquisition entirely, to suspend Preston Hale from any role on the board, and to permit Daniel to continue running the company until the investigation reached its conclusion. Whitfield objected with everything he had left, his arguments growing wilder, but there was no solid ground left beneath his feet. Judge Voss examined the documents with care, compared the signatures line by line, confirmed the dates on which the trust renewals had been filed, and declared that the court had more than sufficient grounds to issue an emergency order. The preliminary ruling came down like a hammer finding its mark. Daniel's authority would not be frozen. The sale of the company was suspended at once. Preston Hale was removed from every decision touching Ashford Harbour and Rail, and Nora Bellamy Ashford was formally recognized as protector of the founding voting authority for the duration of the investigation. A wave of astonished murmuring rolled through the gallery. Vivian Cross shot to her feet to leave, but Judge Voss ordered her to remain, informing her coldly that she might yet be implicated in the manipulation of evidence and the obstruction of a witness. Daniel bowed his head, not out of weakness, but because he knew his empire had just been saved by the very child who had once asked him whether he would ever come back. After the courtroom emptied, Daniel and Nora found each other in the marble corridor outside. There was no flood of theatrical tears between them. They had both survived far too much to turn this moment into a performance. Daniel looked at her for a long while, and finally spoke the thing that had haunted him for days. "I thought you had gone." Nora answered with the faint, level steadiness he had watched her grow into. "I learned from you. When people build a trap in front of the door, you find the way in from the back." Her answer told him everything. That she had not only been raised by him, but had inherited the very shape of his mind, calm, practical, quiet, and yet relentless in its pursuit of the truth all the way to the bottom. Daniel apologized for allowing her past to be dragged into open court, for the way strangers had picked over the hardest years of her life as though they were entries in a ledger. Nora told him it wasn't his fault. "People like Hale and Cross," she said, "always assumed that a person's humble beginnings were something that could be used to shame them. But for Nora, her beginnings were something else entirely, proof that she understood, more deeply than any of her privileged opponents ever could, the true worth of a roof, a signature, and a promise kept." Eli appeared briefly at the end of the hall and folded his adopted sister into a rough embrace, telling her simply that he had always known she would come. The small family stood whole for a moment without any need for further words. Daniel asked her why she hadn't told him her plan before she vanished, why she had let him suffer through those long silent days, believing he might be alone. Nora answered that if he had known, he would have spent every ounce of his strength trying to protect her, and in doing so might have tipped off their enemies and lost the element of surprise. This time, she said, she had wanted to be the one who did the protecting. And there, in that plain corridor, the great emotional truth of the whole story finally settled into place. 15 years earlier, Daniel had walked into Nora's life at the moment she had no one left in the world. 15 years later, she had walked into a courtroom at the moment he was about to lose everything. Daniel's voice was rough when he spoke. "I did not adopt you so that you would save me." Nora answered with the words that closed the circle they had drawn together across a decade and a half. "I know. But you taught me never to let family stand alone out in the rain." They stood together in the quiet. A father and a daughter bound by no blood at all, and by something that had proven, in the end, far stronger than blood. In the weeks that followed, Ashford Harbour and Rail restructured its battered board of directors from the ground up. Preston Hale faced a formal investigation for fraud, for the manipulation of evidence, and for accepting payment from a company tied to Cross Capital, and the polished reputation he'd spent decades building crumbled in days. Vivian Cross lost her acquisition and found herself the subject of a financial inquiry that would follow her for years. Marcus Whitfield quietly withdrew from the case entirely, abandoning his clients in a bid to salvage what remained of his own name, which was, in its way, the most honest thing he'd done in the whole affair. Daniel returned to the company, but he no longer ran it alone. Having learned the hardest way what isolation could cost a man, he appointed Eli to oversee technical operations, the domain his son had always loved best. He asked Carol Whitman to supervise the transparency of the company's records, so that no report would ever again be buried in the dark. And he invited Nora to serve as special legal counsel to the Founders Trust. Not as a family ornament or a symbol of sentiment, but because she had proven herself the one person willing to defend the company from those who would use a contract to break a promise. Nora accepted on the condition that she would answer to the document and to the truth, and to nothing else. Daniel called a gathering of the entire company at the same harbor pier where he had once worked as a young mechanic with grease under his nails and salt in his hair. Standing before the workers, the drivers, the engineers, and the office staff, he told them the short story of a rainy night many years before, not to display his own kindness, but to remind every soul on that pier that Ashford Harbour and Rail had been built on a single unbreakable principle, that no person would ever be left behind merely because they lacked power, money, or a great and familiar name. Nora stood beside him as he spoke, no longer the homeless child of the past, but the woman who had wielded the law itself to protect her family and the thousands of families who depended on the company for their bread. The final scene unfolded on an ordinary morning at the pier, the water bright, the gulls wheeling overhead. Daniel watched the long convoys pulling out of the yards, the containers rising smoothly onto the waiting ships, the private rail line coming alive to begin its patient work of carrying goods across the miles. Nora came to stand beside him and pressed something small and cold into his palm. It was the old house key, the very key he had folded into her 9-year-old hand on the night she had no home at all. She had kept it for 15 years. She looked at him, the ghost of a smile in her eyes. "You gave me a key when I had no home. Today I am only giving you back the key to the empire you built." Daniel turned the worn metal over in his fingers, then slipped it into the pocket of the same old canvas jacket he had worn through every season of his life, from the docks to the boardroom and back again. The $900 million empire was still his, restored and safe. But far more than that, the promise he had spoken beneath a leaking awning on a cold and rainy night, that in his house, nobody would ever be left out in the rain, remained exactly as whole and unbroken as the day he first made it.